All right, welcome to another episode of the Software Speaker Show. And today I have a great honor to introduce to you someone who is a legend in the embedded space, author of multiple books, including this one here, The Art of Designing Embedded Systems. We'll talk about that, why you chose that title. Also author of many articles in publications like this one. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, yeah.
And man who loves embedded systems almost as much as he loves sailing. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jack Ganssle. Welcome to the show.
Hello, everyone. And Jamie, thanks for inviting me on your show. I'm looking forward to it.
Good, excellent. So the first question I ask is the one I always ask all of my guests, which is, what got you into engineering? What happened? What were you doing? How old were you? At what point in your life did you decide that's what I want to do?
You know, that is an interesting question. I've been actually posing that on my Embedded News newsletter lately for people to answer. My dad was a mechanical engineer, and he spent his career in the space program. And so I was always sort of immersed in that. When I was very young, I got somehow interested in electronics and built a crystal radio with the old Quaker Oats oatmeal box, like so many people did way back then. And that interest just blossomed throughout the grade school and high school years. And when I was 16, I was fortunate to be able to snag a job as an electronics technician working on Apollo ground support equipment. And kind of a summer job and weekend job, which was way cool. And I knew by then that engineering is where I wanted to be, specifically electronics. And we got to build some pretty amazing things at that job. I worked over at Goddard Space Flight Center for a summer, installing some of our gear into their manned spacecraft operations center. Being in that environment, being in that engineering lab all day, working with engineers, really showed me that that was what I wanted to do. And I would say by the time I was 13 or 14, I knew that I wanted to be in electronics and that it would be engineering. And so when I went to college, I only looked at engineering schools. But that job at 16, I managed to keep. And it turns out that around 1971, something magical happened. The microprocessor was invented. And the company where I was working, we were doing, everything was analog. But I had learned how to program computers. And they realized they needed to incorporate the microprocessors into these products. Since I was the only one who knew anything about computers, they promoted me to engineer when I was like 18 or 19. And started designing and programming these little micros, which was a ton of fun. And back then, with no responsibilities, I was able to just play and get paid for it. And we would put in 80, 100-hour weeks and get paid for 40, but it was just so cool. It's just so cool.
80? Work 80 and get paid for 40. Yeah.
Well,
that sounds about right.
To get paid anything to do what you love is pretty amazing. That's kind of the definition, I think, of a great career.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, most people would have left it at that. Most people would have said, hey, I got my dream job, I'm doing what I love. You took it a step further. Instead of just being an engineer, you became an engineer who got into writing. How did that happen? I'm an old guy. And when I was young, there were no word processors or anything. There were typewriters. And I hated writing papers for school. I hate it. But I went, same. I did go through 12 years of Catholic education. The last 4 were Jesuits, who are the church's enforcers. And they beat writing and grammar into us, but I still hated it. But in the late 80s, I was running a business, a tools company, and I started to get a little introspective, and I realized that if I wanted to further my career, I would have to learn how to speak in public, which is another thing I was terrified of doing back then, and also to write. And so I set myself the goal of learning to do those things. I started giving some talks at IEEE conferences, and
wrote a few articles for Circuit Seller and a few other magazines, just threw them over the transom, as they say. But in 1989, Tyler Sperry, who was the editor of Embedded Systems Programming, called me and said, "Hey, do you want to write a column?" And I thought, "What? Are you kidding me? This sounds kind of crazy." He said, "Yeah, we'll call it Breakpoints. You can write a monthly column." I thought, well, what's the downside, you know? And so I started doing that, and it turns out that I really loved it. It was a lot of fun. I spent a lot of time perfecting the craft. And I admire so many great writers like Jim Turley, who was a great electronics writer. Oh my God, he has a way with words I could never achieve. But it's fun, and one of the best parts about writing is you get so much feedback from the readers. And it's just a gas to go back and forth, and hardly any death threats, you know.
Hardly. That's good. How do you get? It's an engineering column. Why would you?
I did learn that if I ever use the word evolution in any context, I got a lot of really angry letters in any context.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So I try to stay away from that.
Oh man, techies. Okay. So that got you into writing columns. Then what made you want to write an entire book or many books? Because you've written several. In
the late 80s, as a result of the column I was writing, some people from Academic Press contacted me out of nowhere and said, "Hey, do you want to write a book about electronics?" I thought, well, what? This sounds kind of difficult. And for some reason, I foolishly agreed. And of course, I was about a year late in delivering the manuscript because it is far more work than I ever would have believed. But it was satisfying. It was fun. To see a book on a shelf with your name on it, or my name, not my, I have a brother that writes books too about other things. It's pretty cool. And then I guess I've written or edited 6 books on electronics and 1 on sailing. But to tell you the truth, Jamie, I'm done. They're a lot of work. They're a lot of work.
Fair enough. Did you get to pick the topic exactly, or was that something that the publisher said, "Hey, we want you to write about this specifically"?
They said, "We'd like you to write about embedded systems programming," and everything else was up to me. And so I submitted an abstract, which is what you normally do when you write a book, and then they send it out to reviewers, and the reviewers say, "This is a good idea, this is a bad idea," whatever. And it goes from there. But a book is a couple 100,000 words, and it's not like a program. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be pretty darn good.
Yeah.
And so it takes a lot of editing, a lot of back and forth, and that first one took me a very long time to write. The other ones were somewhat easier. Some of the other ones I was the editor, so I wrote some chapters and solicited chapters from other well-known people like John LaBrosse and some of the others. Yeah, it's very satisfying. And some of the books have been translated into Chinese. For some reason, they sent me a box full of these Chinese books. I can't. The only thing I recognize are the pictures inside of them.
That's awesome. But it must be nice to see your name on a book in Chinese.
I just don't know what to do with them. I can't throw them away.
You can tell the world you speak Chinese, or you write in Chinese. You talked about getting invited to write, and actually, I'm going to go back a little bit further. You said that you realized that in order to advance your career, you were going to have to branch out into speaking and writing. What was it? What made you see that?
I love engineering, but it's a very narrow discipline. And I started an in-circuit emulator company. We made development tools for embedded people. And I started that in '83, I think. And we were pretty successful.
But as part of that, I was interacting with customers a lot, customers all over the world. And I realized that communications of all sorts is so important. And that as an engineer, I was terrible at it. I can remember in high school, we would have to memorize a speech, like a 5-minute speech, and give it in speech class. And I'd be quaking in fear when I was called on to do that. And that is not, that doesn't align well with communicating with the customers and everyone else in the field. And I was looking around, I went to conferences. I really believe in going to conferences. I think one of the big mistakes we make as engineers is burying our head in our current project, kind of like an ostrich. You need to go out and be exposed to things that you've never been exposed to before. And maybe as an aside, one of my pet peeves is Google. Google is great. I mean, it's wonderful. I use it all day, every day. But it only answers the questions you ask it. There's no serendipity. You don't trip across stuff that is unexpected. If you go to a conference, that happens. You go by this booth. Well, I never thought, well, that is a cool part. I could use that part in my next design. Or here's a new technique for doing software engineering I never even thought of. That kind of exposure, I think, is what engineers need to get really well-rounded and to excel in their careers. So I sensed this weakness in myself. And I noted by going to these conferences and going to talks how well and sometimes how poorly some of the speakers did. And so I decided to try and learn it. And I bought books on the subject, studied those, and started practicing. And at first it was horrifying. It was awful. But practice makes perfect. And over time, I learned that speaking in public is actually kind of fun. I tremendously enjoy it now. One of the things I do, at least pre-pandemic, was travel to different companies and give talks about better ways of building embedded systems. And it's so much fun because the engineers are so smart. They ask really compelling questions. They give me ideas I never would have thought of before. And that dialogue, that interaction for me is really, really a wonderful thing. Forgive me if I'm a little scratchy. I have a little bit of a cold today.
No, that's fine. It's fine. It's fine. You talk about you had to teach yourself this discipline, if you will, just by reading books and studying. And as part of that, was there anybody that maybe you relied on that you bounce ideas off of or practice with, or did you have any mentors during that process?
Well, I was working, let me back up. I do believe in mentors. It's very important. I had a mentor, Bob Rosenthal, who was my parents' age, and he and my dad were best friends. Mm-hmm. His son and myself have been best friends for 60 years, and our sons are best friends. So if you
oh, nice.
But Bob was my business mentor. He taught me a lot about running a business. And one of the things I learned was that it's important to hire smart people. So one of the things I did back in I think around 1991 or so, was I hired a business consultant to advise the business. And after I sold that business in 1997, I've kept him on. We, again, pre-COVID, we would meet with him every month and just bounce ideas back and forth, even though the company right now is basically myself and my wife. But you want to tap smart people. And so he had his, and still has his fingers deeply into the business community in terms of management. He was a dean at a university in management. And he would recommend books and resources to use to get better at this. And that's worked really well for me. But I always advise engineers, if you're going to start a consultancy or a business or whatever, even if you can't hire all the people you want, go out and get an advisor or even a board of advisors. Free if you can, pay it if you must. But none of us are smart enough to do this on our own.
That's good. Good advice. What do you say, or what would you say to engineers who say, you know what, I'm smart already. I don't need to speak. I don't need this speaking thing. That's for the marketing guys. That's for the sales guys. What do you say to them?
Well, that is absolutely true for a number of people. I mean, many engineers can be very successful at just staying in the lab all the time. And there's no shame in that. I admire anyone who wants to be just connected to a soldering iron all day. That's great. But if I look at where we're headed, I mean, you can tell, when I was a young engineer, all engineering happened in the United States and Western Europe. That was it. Today, of course, engineering is spread into every country on the planet. And we are all competing against engineers in India and Uzbekistan and Czech Republic and all of these places. And our jobs can be moved to those places. Absolutely, they can be moved. When I was a young person, they said if you can get a job at IBM, you're done. You're set for life. That's not the way it is anymore.
No.
But one thing that can't be sent away is the engineer who can speak engineering lingo to the engineers here, the engineers in India, profit and loss to the people here, a little bit of features and benefits to the customers, and basically be able to serve as a bridge between the technical community and the rest of the community. And engineers tend to despise marketing people, salespeople, but they are a fact of life. If we don't recognize that, we're just being naive. So the communication is what bridges that. And I think that the engineer of the future who's going to have a rock solid, safe career is somebody who can, dance all of those dances.
Like that, a bridge between everybody.
Yeah, exactly. And part of that is writing, technical writing. I mean, before we started, we were talking a little bit about this. And engineers are sort of famous for being either terrible at writing or despising writing. But it's critically important. I mean, one thing, all we're doing is producing documentation. A C program is basically just executable documentation. And
I like that.
The ability to create both program documentation, but external documentation is really important. And I tell people, every engineer needs to be adept at technical writing. And technical writing is very different from, there's no plot, there are no characters. It means writing short declarative sentences, noun, verb, active voice. And that is a skill that you can attain easily through practice. But there's a secret. Write like you talk. That's what I tell everybody, write like you talk. I think it's a skill that we need to master in order to, as our projects get even more complex, and oh my God, the complexity keeps growing. It's going to take this external documentation to really convey what it is we're building.
Interesting. You I've never heard of that before, that the C program is just executable documentation. So I guess self-documenting code can only take us so far.
This is one of those huge debates in the industry.
Oh boy, here we go.
I have very strong opinions about this. I read a lot of code, and I read code because people send me code. I also do a lot of expert witness work, which often involves reverse engineering code that's been written from countries all over the planet. There's no such thing as self-documenting code. There's code that is self, encrypting code. That's something we certainly don't want. And we can write code that is more self-documenting than otherwise. But when you're reverse engineering code, and if your code is useful, it will be reverse engineered. Somebody, maybe in 2 years, someone else will take over the project, and they're going to have to understand what you did. if you want that code to be understandable, the first thing they're going to do is read the comments and maybe look at the function names, the parameters being passed, but read the comments to get a high-level view. And if those comments aren't excellent, then I think you're doing a disservice to the company that's paying you to write the code. I take great pride in the way I comment code. I think it's so important. And people say, yeah, but it takes time. Yep, sure it does. Right? No question. Spelling things right, that takes time. Putting a semicolon at the end of every line, that takes time. But you got to do it. You know?
Yeah, otherwise it won't work.
Right.
So what advice would you offer to anybody who maybe has realized, like you said, that, you know, maybe they don't want to be an engineer who's just in the lab for the rest of their lives. Maybe they do want to take the next step. What kind of advice would you give them?
I say, you know, it comes down to basics, practice. Set some goals, set modest goals, get as much advice as you can, and try it. Just start doing it, and then critique it. Give it to friends to critique, because that's the way that you're going to constantly get better. And I do believe that it's really important. Whoops, this is an important break here. I can tell. Thank you. This is my lovely wife is bringing my martini because it's 6 o'clock here.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's 6 o'clock somewhere.
Yeah. So, but you need to practice. You need to get critiqued on it, and you constantly have to strive to get better. I know so many engineers who get stuck in one mode. They learn C99 and they are the best programmers in the world at C99, but they look at a little C11 and they're baffled. Mm-hmm. And a story that illustrates this is my dad, I mentioned, was a mechanical engineer in the space program. And when he worked at Grumman back in the early 60s, he told me that he knew an engineer who was the world's expert at designing wheels for lunar roving vehicles.
Wow.
We know that what happened in 1970, Apollo imploded. I mean, all those jobs were lost. Engineers were pumping gas because there were no engineering jobs. Where is this guy? Where did he go? All he was good at was designing wheels for lunar roving vehicles. You need, yes, specialization is for ants. That's what Robert Heinlein said. And a breadth of experience, whether it's technical and adjuncts to technical, like writing, like speaking, are really important.
Don't just stay technical. I interviewed another gentleman, Adam Carlson. He talked about that, how sometimes we just put blinders on.
Yes.
That's good.
And the other aspect of that is it's fun. Fun to learn. I love learning. It's fun to learn.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So besides, I guess, embedded systems, what else do you enjoy learning?
Lately, I've been studying genetics. I studied virtually no biology or anything in school. I don't know why. And for some reason, I've developed an interest in genetics, DNA, mitosis, meiosis.
Wow.
And I've probably read about 8 or 10 books in the last couple of years about it. I'm working through a college textbook right now.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely no benefit at all, but it's cool stuff. It's sort of like programming. Yeah.
That's cool. Okay, that's the technical stuff. Let's shift a little bit more into the stuff outside technical. You said you wrote a book on sailing.
Yes. Sailing is one of my passions.
Okay.
And I've had sailboats most of the time for the last 50 plus years of various natures, and I've had many adventures and disasters. But in 1992, I entered a race, and I'm not a racer. I just entered for the adventure, and this was a single-handed race from England to the United States. So
Wow.
you had to be alone on your boat. And so I sailed the year before over to England and left my boat in England for a year, and then came back and started the race in '92. And it was phenomenal. It was great. I mean, the boat sank, but other than that, I really had a great time.
Hopefully it sank close to shore.
No, it was I was about 29 days at sea when I was in an 8-day gale and the mast came down.
Oh,
And
wow.
I turned on it's another story, my satellite beacon. And 4 hours later, there was a Canadian Navy P-3 Orion circling overhead, calling me by name. Now, the thing that's funny is that the satellite beacon sends a signal to a spacecraft with a unique ID, so they knew who I was. My dad was a chief engineer on that spacecraft. And when he was designing that, they came to him and said, "You have to put the search and rescue package on the spacecraft." He said, "No, we don't have the weight. There's no way I'm putting it on that spacecraft." And they forced him to. Well, that was the spacecraft that found me. So they vectored a ship over to me, and the ship this is 500 miles from Rhode Island, and they transferred some fuel, but the fuel must have had benzene and it blew up my engine. So I wound up abandoning ship and got picked up by a German container ship. And actually, at this point, I'd been awake for like 3 days. I was exhausted, so I went right to bed on the ship, and an hour later, we were stopped in the water. The ship broke down. I felt like I should be wearing a garlic around me. Anyway, so I wrote a book about that whole experience. And it's actually online. I published it. It's just on my website.
Okay.
But it was a great adventure. I really enjoyed it. Losing the boat sucked, but everything else was great. So now we have a 32-foot boat, and we have sailed us to Bermuda a bunch of times, the Caribbean, the Bahamas. When I sold my business in 1997, I was thinking about reinventing my life, and I said, well, I'm going to do something worthwhile, but I want to take lots of vacation. And so I kind of structured life around the job rather than job around the life, if you know what I mean.
Nice.
And we don't normally get the amount of vacation that I would like, but it's been a great adventure.
That sounds like one. That's interesting. I have read some of the stories that you posted on your blog. Some of them are very interesting.
Some are even true.
Was that I guess the most adventurous, to not use the word scariest, was that the most adventure you've had on your sailing?
Well, there have been so many adventures, it's hard to say. There was one time we're sailing to Bermuda with a couple of us, and a buddy, one of the guys, Bill, got hit in the face by a flying fish in the middle of the night and got sunstroke and all kinds of problems. So we finally hit Bermuda, and he got on a moped, crashing into a car, had 150 stitches.
Oh, wow.
And
not his trip.
No. So communications, the phone system wasn't very good back then, so we couldn't call home. Nobody knew about this. So we flew back, and they asked us to stay on the plane while everyone else got off. And all the wives were waiting at the end of the jetway. This is before the security theater. And finally, a wife said, "Aren't there 4 guys on this plane?" And the stewardess said, "Yeah, we're just waiting for their wheelchair." So they were freaking out. Anyway, many adventures, lots of fun. I highly recommend sailing. We were going to go to the Bahamas this year, but COVID shut everything down. So this too shall pass.
It too. Yes, it shall. So I'm assuming that you live somewhere on the East Coast.
Yeah, I'm in Maryland.
Okay.
I'm in a little town called Finksburg, Maryland. We're about 30 miles from Baltimore.
Okay. Okay.
And you're in the Midwest, right? Or Chicago or something?
I'm in Dallas, actually.
Mm.
I'm in Dallas.
I have a son who lives in Austin.
Oh, wow. Very nice.
He lives it there.
Okay. Very good. Oh, good. We're glad he liked it here in Texas. Okay. Well, that pretty much concludes all the questions I had for you. Is there anything else that maybe you'd like to add? Maybe any mentions of any speaking engagements you might have coming up that we should know about?
You know,
Virtual ones, maybe?
this has been a funny year, hasn't it? Very
Yeah.
unprecedented. I'm 67. Last summer, I decided to cut back from 3 or 4 trips a month down to 1 or 2 trips a month. But with the virus, I'm down to 0, which has been not too bad. I mean, there's plenty of things to do. So no speaking engagements, but I wait to see what 2021 brings. It'll be, I'm sure, a lot of opportunities, a lot of new chances to meet people will pop up.
Excellent, excellent. Well, the next time you're in Dallas, please let me know. I would like to
I will.
come and see you. Okay. Well, I will stop the recording there and we can chat a little bit more.
Okay.